storms, the occasional growl of thunder, and the scent of damp earth create a world both soothing and unsettling. But in the remote village of Kiravati, the rain brings more than just water. It brings whispers of terror. Legends speak of a spirit that roams the muddy paths on stormy nights, its mournful song drifting through the air like a siren's call. They call it the rain caller, a vengeful specter with a chilling tale of betrayal and death. Most villagers know better than to venture out when the skies weep, but not everyone heeds the warnings. What begins as an ordinary journey home for a skeptical man soon turns into a nightmare he cannot escape. As the rain falls heavier and the night grows darker, he finds himself drawn into a deadly game with something far beyond his comprehension. Step into the storm and let this tale of fear and sorrow take hold. But be warned, once you hear the rain caller's song, it might never leave your mind. The rain came down in torrents, the kind that drowned the world in its endless roar and turned the dirt roads of the village into a slush of mud and misery. Raman clutched his lantern tightly as he made his way back home from the neighboring village. His cart had broken down earlier that evening, and the storm showed no signs of abating. The path was deserted, lined by skeletal trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Every so often, the wind would howl through the branches, sending a chill down his spine. Yet it was the uncanny quietness between the gusts that unnerved him the most. The village elders had often warned against traveling on stormy nights, speaking of the rain caller, a malevolent spirit that preyed on lone travelers. Raman had always dismissed it as mere folklore until tonight, as he trudged forward. Flickering lantern light barely illuminating the path ahead, he heard it, a faint, melodic humming carried by the wind. He stopped in his tracks, peering into the darkness. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but undeniably there. A shiver ran through him as he realized it wasn't the kind of tune someone might hum. It was otherworldly, hollow, and strangely sad. Just a wind, he muttered to himself, quickening his pace. But the humming grew louder, closer, almost as if it was following him ahead. A lone figure appeared, standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, drenched from head to toe, her long hair plastered to her pale face. She wore an old, tattered saree that clung to her thin frame. She was facing away from him, but her presence was unnatural, kind that made his instinct scream to turn back. "Who's there?" Raman called out, though his voice trembled. The woman didn't respond. Instead, began to sway gently, her movements eerily in sync with the humming. The lantern in Raymond's hand flickered violently before extinguishing altogether, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled to relight it, but his hands were shaking too much. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and when he looked up, the woman was no longer there. A flash of lightning illuminated the path, and his heart stopped. She was now standing mere feet away, her face hidden behind a curtain of wet hair. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice cracking with sorrow. Raman stumbled backward, his feet slipping in the mud. I can't. I have to go." Her head tilted unnaturally to the side, revealing one pale, lifeless eye staring through the curtain of hair. "You're already too late." Suddenly, the world erupted into chaos. Rain intensified, thunder roared like an enraged beast, and the wind whipped around him with such force that he thought it might tear him apart. Through the cacophony, the woman's humming transformed into a piercing wail. Raman turned and ran blindly into the storm, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. The wailing followed him, echoing unnaturally in every direction. He could feel her presence behind him, a cold, suffocating energy that seemed to sap the strength from his legs. He spotted a small, abandoned hut ahead and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut. His chest heaved as he pressed his back against the door, listening intently. The rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, and the wailing seemed to fade. For a brief moment, he thought he was safe, but then he saw the puddle forming at his feet, dark water seeping in from beneath the door. It carried with it the faint scent of decay. The humming returned, softer now but unmistakable, and with it came a voice whispering his name. He spun around, and there she was, standing in the corner of the hut. Her body was partially submerged in the puddle as if she were rising from it, her face contorted into an expression of rage and despair. "You left me," she hissed. "I don't know you," Raman cried. Pressing himself against the wall, her form began to shift and distort, her limbs elongating as she crawled toward him. "You all left me, and now you'll stay." The lantern in his hand shattered, plunging the room into utter darkness. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the villagers found Raymond's lifeless body in the middle of the road, his His eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of sheer terror, and his skin was ice cold despite the warming sun. The elders shook their heads knowingly. The rain caller took him, one of them murmured out from that day on. No one in the village dared to travel on rainy nights, for the rain caller's song still echoed through the storm, searching for her next victim. This story blends atmospheric tension with a terrifying ghostly presence, leaving the reader haunted by the rain caller's eerie melody. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. The rain whisperer. The rain fell in thick sheets over the small village of Hallows End, remote settlement tucked deep into a valley where the nearest town was miles away. On nights like this, the villagers locked their doors and kept their lamps burning, whispering prayers to keep the darkness at bay. But for Jonathan Rake, a traveling journalist seeking stories of the supernatural, Hallows Inn was the perfect place to uncover the truths hidden in local legends. Jonathan had rented a small, dilapidated cabin at the edge of the village. It was said to be cursed, a place where no villager dared tread. Local lore spoke of the rain whisperer, a ghostly figure that appeared only on stormy nights, her eerie voice blending with the sound of the rain to lure victims into the woods. Never to be seen again, Jonathan, armed with his tape recorder, notebook, and a relentless curiosity, was determined to unravel the mystery. The storm raged as he set up his equipment. Near the single grimy window of the cabin, thunder growled like an unseen beast, and the wind howled, rattling the wooden shutters. The rain drummed incessantly on the roof, drowning out all but the loudest sounds. Jonathan waited, his pen poised above his notebook, his recorder capturing the cacophony of the storm. As the clock struck midnight, a peculiar sound reached his ears, a soft, melodic hum, almost imperceptible against the rain. He strained to hear it, heart pounding. The hum grew louder, transforming into a haunting lullaby. Jonathan's skin prickled. He grabbed his flashlight and notebook, cautiously stepping outside into the storm. The sound guided him to the woods behind the cabin. Lightning illuminated the path sporadically, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed among the trees. The lullaby grew clearer, its sweetness belying the chilling undertone that made Jonathan's every instinct scream to turn back. He pressed on, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. The melody drew him deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the air felt heavier. Suddenly, the song ceased, leaving only the relentless patter of rain. Jonathan stopped, his breath visible in the cold air, his flashlight beam trembling as he swept it across the clearing he had entered. In the center stood a figure, her back turned to him. She was clad in a tattered, rain-soaked dress, her long hair hanging limp round her shoulders. Jonathan froze, unable to look away as she began to turn. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to suck in the light. She opened her mouth, but instead of a scream or words, the lullaby poured forth. More chilling now than ever, Jonathan stumbled backward, his flashlight falling from his hand and plunging the clearing into near total darkness. The lullaby grew louder, oppressive, invading his mind and making it hard to think. He turned and ran, branches clawing at him as he fled blindly through the woods. The song followed him, echoing from all directions, an inescapable torment. Finally, he burst out of the woods and into the open field near the cabin. He tripped and fell, the rain soaking him to the bone as he gasped for air. The song stopped, abruptly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the rain. Jonathan looked back at the woods, but there was no sign of the rain whisperer. He staggered back to the cabin, locking the door and collapsing onto the floor. The tape recorder lay where he had left it, still running. Trembling, he rewound the tape and pressed play. At first, he heard only the rain and thunder, but then the lullaby began, clear and haunting. But it wasn't just a lullaby. Faint whispers accompanied it, voices layered and indistinct, as if dozens of people were murmuring just out of earshot. Jonathan listened, his blood running cold as the whispers grew louder, forming words you shouldn't have followed. The tape ended abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan's resolve to uncover the truth wavered for the first time. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, the rain's relentless rhythm now a sinister reminder. What he had witnessed, that by morning the storm had passed, and the sun cast an almost mocking warmth over Hallows End. Jonathan packed his belongings and left the cabin without a backward glance. The villagers avoided his gaze as he drove away, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. He never published his findings, but those who knew him said he was never the same after that night. cabin remains abandoned to this day, and on rainy nights, some say you can still hear the rain whisperer's song, beckoning the curious and the foolish into the woods. On stormy nights in Hallows End, the rain doesn't just fall, it speaks. Whispers blend with the downpour, weaving eerie tales of those who vanished without a trace. Villagers bolt their doors, their trembling prayers lost in the tempest, for they know the legend too well, the rain whisperer, a spectral figure, whose haunting song lures the unwary to their doom. For generations, her story has been told in hushed tones, warning to never follow the melody in the rain. But Jonathan Rake, a traveling journalist with a penchant for the supernatural, was not one to heed warnings. To him, the rain whisperer was a tantalizing mystery, a story waiting to be unraveled. With a tape recorder, a notebook, and a stubborn resolve, he arrived in Hallows End on a night when the storm promised to be relentless. Jonathan had rented a small, dilapidated cabin at the edge of the village. It was said to be cursed, a place where no villager dared tread. Armed with his equipment and curiosity, he believed this stormy night would be his chance to uncover the truth. The rain fell in thick sheets, drowning the world in a symphony of water and thunder. As midnight approached, the storm reached its crescendo, and Jonathan waited, his pen poised and his recorder running. Then it began a soft, melodic hum, almost imperceptible against the rain. The sound sent a shiver down his spine, its eerie beauty both captivating and unsettling. The hum grew louder, transforming into a haunting lullaby. Jonathan's skin prickled as he grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside into the storm. The melody guided him, pulling him toward the woods behind the cabin. Lightning illuminated the path sporadically, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed among the trees. The lullaby grew clearer, its sweetness belying the chilling undertone that made Jonathan's every instinct scream to turn back. But he pressed on, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. The melody drew him deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the air felt heavier. Suddenly, the song ceased, leaving only the relentless patter of rain. Jonathan stopped, his breath visible in the cold air, his flashlight beam trembling as he swept it across the clearing he had entered. In the center stood a figure, her back turned to him. She was clad in a tattered, rain-soaked dress, her long hair hanging limp around her shoulders. Jonathan froze, unable to look away as she began to turn. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to suck in the light. She opened her mouth, but instead of a scream or words, the lullaby poured forth. More chilling now than ever, Jonathan stumbled backward, his flashlight falling from his hand and plunging the clearing into near total darkness. The lullaby grew louder, oppressive, invading his mind and making it hard to think. He turned and ran, branches clawing at him as he fled blindly through the woods. The song followed him, echoing from all directions, an inescapable torment. Finally, he burst out of the woods and into the open field near the cabin. He tripped and fell, the rain soaking him to the bone as he gasped for air. The song stopped, abruptly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the rain. Jonathan looked back at the woods, but there was no sign of the rain whisperer. He staggered back to the cabin, locking the door and collapsing onto the floor. The tape recorder lay where he had left it, still running. Trembling, he rewound the tape and pressed play. At first, he heard only the rain and thunder, but then the lullaby began, clear and haunting. But it wasn't just a lullaby. Faint whispers accompanied it, voices layered and indistinct, as if dozens of people were murmuring just out of earshot. Jonathan listened, his blood running cold as the whispers grew louder, forming words you shouldn't have followed. The tape ended abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan's resolve to uncover the truth wavered for the first time. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, the rain's relentless rhythm now a sinister reminder. What he had witnessed, not by morning, the storm had passed, and the sun cast an almost mocking warmth over Hallows End. Jonathan packed his belongings and left the cabin without a backward glance. The villagers avoided his gaze as he drove away, their expressions a mixture of pity and fear. He never published his findings, but those who knew him said he was never the same after that night. The cabin remains abandoned to this day, and on rainy nights, some say you can still hear the rain whisperer's song, beckoning the curious and the foolish into the woods. Shadows in the rain city pulsed with life even as the rain poured relentlessly, its neon lights bleeding into the slick asphalt streets for most residents of Grayford. The storm was just another feature of urban life and inconvenience at worst, but for Emily Walker, it was the start of something she would never forget. Emily was a junior architect working late in her high-rise office. Deadlines loomed, and her team had already left for the night. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, drowning out the distant hum of the city below. She glanced at the clock, 11:43 p.m. With a sigh, she saved her work and prepared to leave. As she stepped into the elevator, the fluorescent lights flickered. The sudden stutter sent a shiver down her spine, but she shrugged it off. "Oh, building quirks," she muttered. The elevator doors slid open to the lobby, empty except for the security guard, Carl, who sat slouched behind his desk. He nodded as she passed, raincoat pulled tight around her. The streets were nearly deserted, the rain creating a shimmering curtain that distorted the familiar. Emily held her umbrella tightly as she walked toward the subway station a few blocks away. The air felt heavier than usual, oppressive and thick, as if the storm was bearing down on her alone. Turning a corner, she paused. A shadow moved where no shadow should be. She squinted through the rain but saw nothing. Her pulse quickened as she hurried her steps. The sound of water splashing behind her made her stop again. She turned. No one was there. The subway entrance yawned ahead, a bright, if grimy, beacon in the downpour. Emily descended quickly, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. The platform was eerily empty. Her footsteps echoed unnervingly as she moved to the edge, peering down the dark tunnel for the approaching train. The whisper came then, faint but unmistakable. "Emily," she spun around, her breath caught in her throat. The platform was empty. Her reflection in the tiled wall opposite stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. She took a step backward, clutching her umbrella like a weapon. The whisper came again, louder this time, and with it, a shadow moved along the wall. It didn't follow the angles of the station or the light sources. It moved independently, deliberately. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. A gust of cold air rushed through the tunnel, and the train's headlights appeared in the distance. Relief flooded her as the rumbling grew louder. She turned toward the tracks, waiting for the doors to open so she could escape this unnerving place. As the train slowed to a halt, she saw it again in the reflection of the glass doors, the shadow. It stood directly behind her, an amorphous darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe. Emily whirled around, but there was nothing there. Heart pounding, she stepped onto the train and chose a seat near other passengers. They were sparse but present: an old man reading a newspaper, a woman scrolling on her phone, a teenager listening to music. Their mundane presence calmed her slightly. The train rattled through the underground, and Emily tried to shake the unsettling encounter, but her reflection in the window betrayed her attempt at calm. The shadow was still there, now seated beside her. Its form was clearer now, vaguely human but grotesquely wrong. Its featureless face turned toward her as if studying her reaction. She bolted upright, startling the other passengers. The shadow vanished as soon as she moved, leaving her questioning her sanity. The teenager pulled out an earbud. "You okay?" he asked, his voice concerned. Yeah, just tired," Emily stammered, sitting back down but keeping her eyes on her own lap. She clenched her hands together, willing herself to hold on until her stop. When the train finally screeched to a halt at her station, Emily rushed out without looking back. The rain greeted her once more as she climbed the stairs to the surface. Half ran, half stumbled toward her apartment, the feeling of being watched never leaving her. In the safety of her home, Emily locked the door, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She leaned against the wall, her mind racing to rationalize what she had seen. The lights flickered briefly, drawing her attention to the darkened corner of her living room. Dotted stood there, waiting. The shadow no longer needed the rain. Echoes of the Forgotente rain turned the sprawling city of Evernight into a maze of reflections and shimmering lights in a crumbling neighborhood near the river. The sound of water dripping into unseen cracks and seeping through aged bricks was a constant backdrop. The old building at the heart of the district, known simply as the Mirage, was infamous. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its facade darkened with grime. Its history whispered in fragments of fire, disappearances, and unspoken tragedies. Leah Parker, paranormal investigator with a reputation for finding truth in urban legends, had been drawn to the Mirage by a single clue: an old voice recording. The tape, dated 50 years ago, captured an eerie plea, A voice trembling with desperation. Don't let them find me. They're still here. Leah entered the mirage just as the rain intensified. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with decay and something more sinister. Her flashlight carved weak paths through the shadows, illuminating faded wallpaper and broken furniture. Every sound, her footsteps, the distant creaks of the building settling seemed amplified. If anyone's here, speak now, she called, her voice steady despite the unease coiling in her gut. The only response was the rain hammering against the roof. As Leah ventured deeper, she reached the grand staircase that spiraled into darkness. The steps groaned under her weight. She reached the second floor, where the atmosphere grew colder. The air tinged with a faint metallic scent. Her EMF detector spiked suddenly, its beeping breaking the silence. "All right," she murmured, switching on her voice recorder. "Let's talk." A whisper answered, so faint she wasn't sure she had heard it. She froze, replaying the recorder. There it was again, helpless. Her heart raced as she followed the sound to a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a space untouched by time. A child's rocking horse sat in the corner, its paint peeling. A mirror hung crooked on the wall, its surface cloudy with age. But as Leah stepped inside, the mirror cleared, revealing not a reflection but a figure standing behind her. She spun around, her flashlight slicing through the air, but there was no one there. The mirror, however, showed a different truth. Shadows gathered within it, forming faces twisted in agony. They mouthed words she couldn't hear but felt deep in her chest, a sorrow that threatened to overwhelm her. The rocking horse began to move, its creaking rhythmic and deliberate. Leah stepped back, clutching her flashlight tightly. The EMF detector shrieked, its readings off the charts. A chill swept through the room and the door slammed shut behind her. The voices came then, overlapping whispers that grew louder, forming a cacophony of pleas and warnings. "They're here. We can't escape. Run while you can." Leah's instinct screamed at her to leave, but her resolve held. "Who's here? What happened to you?" she demanded. Mirror's surface rippled like water and a hand emerged, its fingers impossibly long and clawed. Leah stumbled back as the hand reached for her, its movement slow but deliberate. The faces in the mirror screamed silently, their mouths wide with terror. Leah turned and tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned to laughter, dark and mocking, as the room seemed to close in around her. Shadows poured from the mirror, coalescing into a figure that loomed over her, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a guttural growl that echoed in her skull. Summoning all her strength, Leah raised her camera and snapped a photo. The flash momentarily blinded her and illuminated the room. When her vision cleared, the figure was gone and the door creaked open. She didn't hesitate, bolting out of the room and down the stairs. As she reached the street, the rain soaked her to the bone, but she didn't stop running until she was blocks away. Only then did she dare to check her camera. The photo showed the room exactly as she had seen it, but in the corner a shadow lingered, its eyes glowing faintly. Leah never returned to the mirage, but the recording she had captured of the whispers and that final chilling laugh became infamous in paranormal circles. Some say the spirits trapped in the building still call out for help. Others believe they're warning anyone foolish enough to enter that some doors should never be opened. The underpass beneath Serpent's Avenue was a shortcut most avoided. It was dank, graffiti-covered, and poorly lit, but for Greg Thompson, a courier with a deadline, it was the fastest route to his destination. The rain had turned the streets into rivers, and the overpass was his best shelter. As Greg entered the tunnel, the usual hum of traffic above was conspicuously absent. Instead, the sound of the rain seemed muted, replaced by faint whispers that echoed in the confined space. He paused, adjusting his soaked jacket, and scanned the dimly lit passage. Just the wind, he muttered, shaking off the unease. He continued walking, his footsteps splashing in the shallow puddles. The whispers grew louder, words indistinct but urgent. Greg quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering unnaturally in the light of a lone, flickering street lamp at the exit. Halfway through, his phone buzzed. Relief flooded him as he pulled it out, but the screen was blank. The buzzing persisted, vibrating, stronger and stronger until he dropped it. The phone screen lit up for a moment, displaying a single message: "Don't turn around." Against every instinct, Greg turned. The whispers ceased instantly. The underpass was empty, or so it seemed. Then he saw it, a figure at the far end, barely illuminated. It was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted in a grotesque angle. The figure didn't move but seemed to draw closer, the shadows bending toward it. Greg bolted, sprinting toward the exit. The whispers returned, screaming now, filling his ears with overlapping voices. He burst into the open air, rain pelting his face, and didn't stop running until he reached his destination. When he looked back, the underpass was silent again, but the shadows seemed darker, thicker, as if they were watching. He never took that shortcut again, but others did, and not all of them made it out. In the quiet village of Raven's Hollow, an ancient stone well stood at its center. No one used it anymore. The water had long dried up, and the well had gained a reputation for being cursed. The villagers told stories of strange noises heard at night, whispers, sobs, and once the echo of a child's laughter. Maya, a skeptic visiting her grandmother for the summer, dismissed the tales as superstitions. One rainy night, curiosity got the better of her. Armed with a flashlight and a recorder, she ventured to the well. The village streets were deserted. The only sounds the soft patter of rain and the distant hoot of an owl. Standing before the well, Maya peered into its depths. The beam of her flashlight revealed nothing but darkness. She lowered the recorder, whispering into it, checking for anything unusual. So far, it's just an old well. A faint sound emerged, barely audible. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. It was a voice, muffled and distant, calling her name. Maya. Her breath hitched. She shone her flashlight again, but the darkness swallowed it whole. Then the voice came again, louder this time, accompanied by a wet scraping sound, as if something was climbing up. Panicking, Maya stumbled backward. Her flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of movement from the well. A hand pale and glistening with water gripped the edge. Another followed. Slowly, a figure emerged, its features obscured but unmistakably human-like. Its head twisted unnaturally, and its hollow eyes locked onto her. "Help me," it rasped, its voice broken and gurgling. Maya screamed and ran, the recorder slipping from her grasp. She didn't stop until she reached her grandmother's house, slamming the door behind her. When she returned with the villagers the next morning, the well was empty, and her recorder lay cracked on the ground. It still worked, though, playing back a single chilling message: she'll be back. Maya left Raven's Hollow the next day, vowing never to return. But the villagers say the well is louder now, the whispers more frequent, and on rainy nights, they're sure they've seen a girl standing by the well, staring into its depths. The lighthouse keeper's curse, fissure, and ghost horror. Hidden on the remote cliffs of Record, U-2019's Cove, an ancient lighthouse stood watch over the tumultuous sea. Its light had guided ships for centuries, but the last keeper, Marcus Hale, was said to have vanished under mysterious circumstances. Since then, the light would sometimes flicker out, even in calm weather, leading to shipwrecks on the jagged rocks below. And fishermen in the nearby village spoke of hearing Marcus's voice, carried on the wind during storms. They said he was cursed to haunt the lighthouse, forever trying to guide doomed ships to safety, but always failing. In an unfateful night, a fisherman named Caleb decided to investigate. A storm had rolled in, and the lighthouse, U-2019's beam was dark once more. Armed with a lantern, Caleb climbed the rocky path to the tower, determined to confront whatever haunted it. The wind howled and the rain lashed at him, but he pressed on. Inside, the lighthouse was damp and cold, its walls lined with rusted equipment and faded maps. Caleb climbed the spiral staircase, the echoes of his footsteps mingling with the sound of the storm outside. At the top, he found the lantern room, its massive light extinguished. In NA letters, he inspected the machinery. A voice whispered behind him, "U-201 choir, you hear?" U-201D in turned sharply, his lantern casting long shadows. Standing before him was a figure in a tattered keeper U-2019's uniform, water dripping from his pale, translucent form. Marcus Hale, U-2014, or what was left of him. U-201 regarded Caleb with sorrowful eyes. And U-201 Sayo, can U-201-9T fix this? U-201D, Marcus said, his voice like the crash of waves. U-201 sit, U-2019 is too late for them and too late for me. U-201D, and suddenly, the storm outside intensified, and through the window, Caleb saw a ship, U-2019's faint lights approaching the rocks. He turned to Marcus. U-201 Sayo can still guide them. Turned on the light. U-201D In, Marcus shook his head, his form flickering. U-201, the cursed one. U-201-9T, let me. But maybe you can. U-201D. In, Caleb scrambled to the controls, frantically trying to ignite the lantern. Marcus stood beside him, his hands passing through the machinery as he mimed the motions Caleb needed to follow. The light roared to life just as the ship neared the rocks, its crew scrambling to chase of D. Marcus, U-2019's form began to dissolve. U-201 thunk you. U-201D, he whispered before vanishing entirely. The storm subsided and the lighthouse, U-2019's being shone steadily for the first time in decades. Caleb returned to the village with a tale of bravery and redemption. But he knew U-201-9D never forget the haunted look in Marcus, U-2019's eyes. In Story 2, The Crooked Path Village Horror. In the village of Hollowmore, an old fisherman, U-2019's path led from the cliffs to the shore. The path was known as the Crooked Way, a narrow trail twisting through dense woods. Locals avoided it at night, claiming the spirits of drowned sailors roamed the woods, seeking to drag the living into the depths they course. In MBU as the ship sailed to once called home. In Nellie, a skeptical traveler, laughed off the warnings. She needed a shortcut to the harbor and decided to brave the Crooked Way one rainy evening. Armed with a flashlight, she began her descent. The rain turned the trail slick, and the thick canopy of trees blocked out what little moonlight there was. In halfway down, Ellie began to hear it, U-201, for the sound of footsteps behind her, crunching on the wet leaves. She stopped and turned, her flashlight sweeping the trees. No one was there, and she pressed on. The sound of footsteps growing louder, then came the voices, U-201 from low and guttural. As if underwater, U-201 turned back, U-201D they urged, but Ellie shook her head and pressed forward. In, she reached a clearing where the path forked. In the middle stood a man in a fisherman, U-2019's coat, his back to her. And in U-201, excuse me. U-201D, Ellie called. U-201, which way to the harbor? U-201D, and the man didn't U-201-9T respond. Instead, he turned slowly. His face was pale and bloated, water streaming from his empty eye sockets. Ellie screamed and ran down the left fork, her flashlight flickering wildly. And voices followed her, louder now, chanting in a language she didn't U-201-9T understand. She stumbled and fell, her flashlight skittering into the darkness. Crawling forward, she found herself at the edge of a cliff. Below, the waves crashed against the rocks, and through the mist, she saw ghostly figures rising from the water, their hands reaching for her. And just as one icy hand closed around her ankle, Ellie felt herself being pulled back. She turned to see an old man, the village U-2019's reclusive fisherman, holding her tightly. U-201, the Crooked Way doesn't U-201-9T forgive. U-201D, he said, dragging her to safety. And Nellie left Hollowmore the next morning, vowing never to speak of what U-201-9D seen. But the villagers knew better. The Crooked Way remained, its secrets buried in the storm arrived without warning, its thunderous growl rolling across the vast, empty fields. The downpour transformed the dirt paths into treacherous, glistening trails, and the trees lining the village swayed violently, their skeletal branches clawing at the air like restless spirits done inside an old, decrepit farmhouse on the outskirts of the village. A single lamp flickered, casting eerie shadows on the damp wooden walls. Anna, a young woman seeking solace from the chaos of city life, sat by the cracked window, watching the rain lash against the glass. Had heard the stories the villagers spoke of strange happenings on nights like this, whispers of a ghostly figure wandering the fields, or sorrowful cries carried by the wind. Some claimed to have seen her, others dismissed it as old superstitions meant to keep children indoors. Anna, ever the skeptic, had laughed at the tales, but tonight the laughter felt distant. The storm seemed alive, its howling winds carrying a melody that made her uneasy. It was as if the storm was trying to speak, its voice a mix of agony and desperation. A sudden knock at the door shattered her thoughts. It wasn't the gentle rap of a visitor, it was a forceful, rhythmic pounding that echoed through the empty house. Anna froze, her heart racing. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one should have been out in weather like this. She hesitated, then called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Only the rain answered, its relentless drumming against the roof. The knock came again, louder. This time, Anna's breath hitched as she approached the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, the pounding of her heart nearly as loud as the storm outside. She grabbed the rusted doorknob, its icy chill seeping into her palm, and pulled the door open just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The rain hammered the porch, and the wind howled like a wounded animal, but there was no one there. The muddy path leading to the house was empty, save for the rainwater pooling in uneven patches. A sharp gust of wind pushed the door fully open, and Anna stumbled back. That's when she noticed it, footprints in the mud, bare human footprints leading from the path straight to her door. She looked out into the storm, squinting through the sheets of rain. Her eyes caught movement in the distance, a figure standing still at the edge of the field. Facing her, the figure was cloaked in shadow, and yet Anna felt its gaze piercing through her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step forward. Anna slammed the door shut and bolted it. Her hands shaking, she backed away, tripping over a loose floorboard and falling onto the cold wooden floor. The knocking resumed, but this time it wasn't at the door. It was coming from the window. Anna turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. A pale hand, skeletal and dripping with rainwater, pressed against the glass behind it. A face appeared, gone hollow-eyed and grinning with a malice that froze her blood. The figure whispered her name. Anna scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The face at the window was gone, but the lingering sense of its presence hung heavy in the air. She pressed her back against the door, clutching a rusted fireplace poker she'd grabbed in desperation. The farmhouse creaked, its old wooden frame groaning as the storm battered it. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind rattling the shutters, the drip of rainwater from the leaky roof, the distant echo of a mournful wail that sent chills coursing through her. She tried to steady her breathing. Think, Anna, think. Her gaze fell on the window again. The pale handprint was still there, smudged and glistening in the faint light of the flickering lamp. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the staircase leading to the second floor. Her grip tightened on the poker as she moved cautiously toward the stairs. Each creak of the old wooden steps made her wince, but the whispering grew louder with every step she climbed. At the top of the stairs, she froze. The hallway stretched before her, its shadows dancing with the flickering light from a single swinging bulb. At the far end, the door stood ajar, revealing a room bathed in an eerie blue glow. "Anna," the voice called again, a raspy, broken sound that made her stomach churn. She stepped into the hallway, drawn toward the glow despite every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. As she neared the room, she noticed the old photographs on the walls, black and white portraits of somber-faced people, their eyes following her as she moved. Inside the glowing room, a single object lay in the center, an old, weathered music box. Its lid was open and a haunting melody played, the tune both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Anna approached cautiously, her heart pounding. The music box had intricate carvings, a woman in a flowing dress, standing in a field under a stormy sky. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like the wind outside. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and closed the lid. Silence. For a brief moment she thought it was over, then she heard the door behind her creak open. Turning slowly, she saw her, the girl from the window, but now Anna could see her fully, her face gone and lifeless, her eyes black pits that seemed to consume the dim light around her. The girl raised a bony hand and pointed directly at Anna, her mouth twisting into an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have come here." Anna stumbled back, her breathing shallow and frantic as the girl's words echoed in her ears. The room grew thick and heavy, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. She wanted to scream, but her voice felt trapped, just like her in this house. "You shouldn't have come here," the girl repeated, her voice layered with an otherworldly resonance. The music box sprang open on its own, the haunting melody filling the room once more. Anna's eyes darted toward it, and she noticed something new, a small key inside the box, glinting under the eerie blue glow. The girl stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were a puppet on invisible strings. Anna's instinct screamed at her to run, but her curiosity about the key anchored her in place. "What do you want?" Anna managed to choke out, gripping the fireplace poker like a lifeline. The girl tilted her head, her dark, empty eyes narrowing. "To remember," she whispered. "Remember what?" The girl raised her hand again, this time pointing toward the photographs lining the hallway. Slowly, the images began to shift. The once static face faces morphing into anguished expressions. One portrait caught Anna's attention, a young woman standing beside the farmhouse. Her resemblance to Anna uncanny. "It's you," Anna murmured, her voice barely audible. The girl nodded, her twisted smile fading into an expression of sorrow. "You are part of this place, and it is part of you." Anna's mind raced. Memories she couldn't place flashed before her visions of the house in its prime, filled with laughter and warmth, followed by darkness, screams, and the cold embrace of rain-soaked earth. "What happened here?" Anna demanded, her voice trembling before the girl could answer. The floor beneath Anna's feet groaned loudly, splintering as if the house itself were alive. The room tilted violently, and she fell, tumbling into darkness. When Anna opened her eyes, she was no longer in the glowing room. Instead, she found herself in a damp, underground chamber. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The faint glow of the music box illuminated the space, revealing rows of crude wooden crosses embedded in the dirt walls. At the center of the room stood a single gravestone, its inscription worn and barely legible. Anna knelt before it, brushing away the dirt. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the name carved into the stone. It was her own. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic, as if 100 voices were speaking at once. The girl appeared again, standing beside the gravestone. "You don't belong here," she said, her tone urgent. "But they won't let you leave." Who won't let me leave?" Anna shouted, panic rising. The girl pointed behind Anna. Slowly, she turned to see a crowd of shadowy figures emerging from the darkness. Their hollow eyes fixed on her. The shadowy figures crept closer, their movements deliberate and menacing. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and Anna could feel the weight of their collective gaze, as if they were peeling back layers of her soul. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice trembling. "They want what was taken," the girl said, her voice low and somber. "They were wrong, and so were you." Anna staggered backward, her mind racing. "What was taken? I don't understand." The girl extended a hand, her expression a mix of pity and urgency. "The key. Use the key." Anna's hand flew to the music box, now clutched tightly against her chest. The small, cold key was still inside. With trembling fingers, she plucked it out, its metallic surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. "What does it open?" "Your memory," the girl said, her figure flickering like a dying flame in their rest. Before Anna could question her further, the girl vanished, leaving only the shadowy figures and their relentless approach. Anna spun around, searching for anything that might hint at what to do next. Her eyes landed on a rusted iron door embedded in the far wall of the chamber. It was ancient and weathered, its surface covered in strange, unearthly symbols. The shadows surged forward, their ghostly forms distorting and merging, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Anna didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the door, dodging outstretched hands that seemed to claw the air around her. Reaching the door, she jammed the key into the lock and turned it. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a blinding light that swallowed everything. Anna found herself standing in a different place, entirely a field bathed in golden sunlight, the farmhouse visible in the distance. The storm was gone, and the air was warm and fragrant with wild flowers. For a moment, she thought she had escaped. But then she noticed them figures scattered across the field, frozen in various poses of anguish. Their faces were the same as the ones in the photographs. A deep voice rumbled from behind her. "You've unlocked the past, but can you bear its weight?" She turned to see a tall, cloaked figure, its face hidden in shadow. The figure pointed to the farmhouse, which now appeared vibrant and alive, as though she had stepped back in time. "You must set it right," the figure intoned. Anna hesitated, then walked toward the house. As she stepped inside, she saw it as it had once been, filled with life, laughter, and the scent of freshly baked bread. But there was a darkness here, too, lurking in the corners. In the parlor, she saw a woman standing by the window herself, but not quite. The woman looked younger, happier, and yet there was a sadness in her eyes. Anna gasped as memories flooded her mind, arguments with a man whose face she couldn't fully see, nights spent in this very house with an oppressive sense of dread. And finally, the stormy night when it all ended in blood and betrayal. She stumbled backward as the vision faded, leaving her alone in the dim, decrepit farmhouse once again. The truth hit her like a blow. This wasn't just a haunting. She was tied to this place, its secrets, and its restless dead. The cloaked figure's voice echoed in her mind. "Set it right." Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. As if 100 voices were speaking at once, the girl appeared again, standing beside the gravestone. "You don't belong here," she said, her tone urgent. "But they won't let you leave." "Who won't let me leave?" Anna shouted, panic rising. The girl pointed behind Anna. Slowly, she turned to see a crowd of shadowy figures emerging from the darkness. Their hollow eyes fixed on her. The shadowy figures crept closer, their movements deliberate and menacing. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and Anna could feel the weight of their collective gaze, as if they were peeling back layers of her soul. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice trembling. "They want what was taken," the girl said, her voice low and somber. "They were wrong, and so were you." Anna staggered backward, her mind racing. "What was taken? I don't understand." The girl extended a hand, her expression a mix of pity and urgency. "The key. Use the key." Anna's hand flew to the music box, now clutched tightly against her chest. The small, cold key was still inside. With trembling fingers, she plucked it out, its metallic surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. "What does it open?" "Your memory," the girl said, her figure flickering like a dying flame in their rest. Before Anna could question her further, the girl vanished, leaving only the shadowy figures in their relentless approach. Anna spun around, searching for anything that might hint at what to do next. Her eyes landed on a rusted iron door embedded in the far wall of the chamber. It was ancient and weathered, its surface covered in strange, unearthly symbols. The shadows surged forward, their ghostly forms distorting and merging, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Anna didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the door, dodging outstretched hands that seemed to claw the air around her. Reaching the door, she jammed the key into the lock and turned it. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a blinding light that swallowed everything. Anna found herself standing in a different place, entirely a field bathed in golden sunlight, the farmhouse visible in the distance. The storm was gone, and the air was warm and fragrant with wild flowers. For a moment, she thought she had escaped, but then she noticed them figures scattered across the field, frozen in various poses of anguish. Their faces were the same as the ones in the photographs. A deep voice rumbled from behind her. "You've unlocked the past, but can you bear its weight?" She turned to see a tall, cloaked figure, its face hidden in shadow. The figure pointed to the farmhouse, which now appeared vibrant and alive, as though she had stepped back in time. "You must set it right," the figure intoned. Anna hesitated, then walked toward the house. As she stepped inside, she saw it as it had once been, filled with life, laughter, and the scent of freshly baked bread. But there was a darkness here, too, lurking in the corners. In the parlor, she saw a woman standing by the window herself, but not quite. The woman looked younger, happier, and yet there was a sadness in her eyes. Anna gasped as memories flooded her mind, arguments with a man whose face she couldn't fully see, nights spent in this very house with an oppressive sense of dread, and finally, the stormy night when it all ended in blood and betrayal. She stumbled backward as the vision faded, leaving her alone in the dim, decrepit farmhouse once again. The truth hit her like a blow. This wasn't just a haunting. She was tied to this place, its secrets, and its restless dead. The cloaked figure's voice echoed in her mind, "Set it right." The oppressive silence of the house pressed against Anna. As she stood motionless in the parlor, the fragments of memory clawed at her mind, demanding to be pieced together. She looked around, her gaze landing on a large wooden chest in the corner of the room. Its surface was scratched and worn, but its lock glinted ominously in the faint light. The key in her hand felt heavier now, as if imbued with the weight of the past. Approached the chest cautiously, kneeling before it. The air around her seemed to hum, the presence of the restless spirits growing stronger. With a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock. The chest creaked open, revealing a collection of items: a blood-stained diary, a rusted knife, and a locket containing a photograph of a man and a young woman. Anna's hands trembled as she opened the diary. The handwriting was elegant but frantic, the ink smudged in places as if written in a hurry. "He promised me love, but he brought only pain. The storms are his doing, a curse tied to this house to me. He said if I could not have him, no one would. The others, they tried to help me. Now they are trapped here, their souls bound to this place. My guilt keeps me tethered. I was his undoing, and he mine." The final entry ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. The truth was undeniable now. Anna wasn't merely connected to the house, she had lived and died here. The victim of betrayal and violence, the restless spirits weren't just random victims. They had been her friends, her family, the people who tried to save her. Tears streamed down her face as the memory solidified. The man in the locket had been her husband, and his greed and fury had cursed them all. The floor beneath her groaned, and the shadows in the room thickened, coalescing into the figures she had seen before. They surrounded her, their faces etched with sorrow and anger. "What do you want me to do?" Anna whispered, her voice cracking. The cloaked figure appeared once more, looming in the doorway. Its voice was a low rumble. "Break the curse, free them." How the figure extended a skeletal hand, pointing to the knife in the chest. "Blood bound them to this place. Blood must release them." Anna stared at the knife, dread settling deep in her chest. The blade was dull, rusted, and carried the weight of countless lives. She picked it up, her reflection warped in its tarnished surface. "Do it," one of the spirits urged, its voice hollow and pleading. "Set us free." With trembling hands, Anna pressed the blade to her palm and drew it across her skin. The pain was sharp and immediate, her blood dripping onto the floor. The house seemed to shudder, its walls groaning as the spirits began to fade. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. The figure smiled faintly before dissolving into wisps of light, leaving Anna alone in the parlor. The cloaked figure nodded approvingly. "You have freed them and yourself." Before Anna could respond, the figure vanished, leaving her with the chest, the diary, and the realization that the house was no longer a prison. As Anna stepped outside, the storm had cleared, revealing bright, starlit sky. The farmhouse stood silently behind her, its shadows no longer menacing but solemn, as if it too had been freed. She turned back one last time, her heart heavy yet relieved. The memories would remain, but the burden was gone. Anna walked away, key still in her pocket, a reminder of what had been and what she had overcome. Titled "The Whispering Rain," it had been raining for hours. When David first arrived at the old farmhouse, he had driven miles through the winding, deserted roads, his windshield wipers battling the torrential downpour. The village had been small and isolated, and this particular house, perched on the edge of the woods, was as much a legend as it was a reality. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning anyone who dared approach after dusk. But David, skeptical and needing somewhere to stay, had ignored the warnings. As the headlights of his car illuminated the path to the house, an eerie stillness hung in the air. The sound of raindrops hitting the roof and windows was almost deafening. Yet there was an unsettling silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath. He parked near the porch and hurried inside, pulling his suitcase behind him. The interior was cold and musty, the air thick with mildew. The floorboards creaked as he moved, and his footsteps echoed unnervingly. He set his bag down and tried to turn on the lights, but the power had gone out. No surprise, this place seemed to have been abandoned for years. David shrugged it off and lit a few candles he found on the mantelpiece. He hadn't planned to stay long, just a place to rest before he continued his journey in the morning. But as he settled into the armchair by the dim candlelight, the wind howled outside, and the rain pounded against the windows. It was then that he heard the first whisper. At first, he thought it was the whine and distant moan from the trees. But as he strained to listen, the whisper came again, this time clearer. It was a soft, indistinct voice, barely audible above the storm. David stood up, unease creeping into his bones, and scanned the room. Nothing, just shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. Shaking his head, he dismissed it as his imagination. The house was old, creaky, and probably full of rodents. He returned to his seat, trying to distract himself with a book he found on the table. But the whispers persisted, growing slightly louder with each passing minute. David's heart began to race. He stood again, his mind refusing to accept what his senses were telling him. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from within the house. The air around him felt colder now, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He had to leave, had to get out of there. But as he reached for his coat, the door slammed shut with a force that made the entire house shake. David spun around, panic rising in his chest. The room was darker now, the shadows deeper, and the whispers were no longer whispers. They were voices speaking to him. Not one, but many, murmuring words in a language he couldn't understand. Then a single word broke through the cacophony, clear as day. "Leave." David's body froze. The voice came from the far corner of the room, from the shadows. It was soft, but filled with an unmistakable sense of dread. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward the darkened corner. He saw nothing, but then he heard a faint rustling, like the soft shuffle of footsteps on a wooden floor. He strained his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was there, a shape standing just beyond the light. Before he could react, the shape moved, crossing the room in a blur. David stumbled back, his mind racing. He tried to shout, but his voice caught in his throat. Panic surged through him as the temperature in the room dropped further, the air thickening. Pressing in around him, the whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, till they were a deafening chorus of unintelligible words. Suddenly, the door to the room swung open and David darted through it, his feet slipping on the wet floor. He ran down the narrow hallway, the wall seeming to close in on him. He reached the stairs, but as he descended into the darkness below, a hand gripped his ankle. Icy and unyielding, he screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the grip tightened. His eyes snapped open to see nothing but a dark void beneath him. The house seemed to be sinking into itself, like the earth was swallowing it whole. Please. No, he gasped, trying to break free, but his body grew colder with every second. The whispers were everywhere now, deafening, overwhelming, and then everything stopped. The whispers faded and the oppressive cold lifted. David blinked, finding himself back in the armchair, the candle still flickering in front of him. The storm outside had passed and the night was eerily calm. He breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was all just a nightmare. Maybe it had been. Too much isolation, too much darkness. But as he looked down at his hands, his heart froze. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his fingers felt cold to the touch. The room, too, looked different, worn, abandoned, as though it had been untouched for years. A chill ran down his spine, and then, from the corner of the room, came the voice once again, "Leave." David's blood ran cold. He turned toward the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The house seemed to watch him, its very walls closing in, suffocating him. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling his mind with a flood of images, broken windows, abandoned graves, the restless spirits of those who had once lived here, all reaching out to claim him. With a final scream, David bolted for the door, but as he reached it, the lock clicked into place and the room became prison. The last thing he heard was the faintest whisper, barely audible, as if carried on the wind. You should have listened. The rain had stopped. The whispers, too, faded into the night. But the house remained waiting. The old road leading to the village had always been treacherous, especially during storms. It twisted through dense woods, flanked by towering trees that seemed to reach down like skeletal hands. Martin had traveled it many times, but tonight the fog was thick, swirling around him, thick as a blanket. The headlights of his car barely cut through the mist as he drove, every turn feeling more unsettling than the last. The rain had stopped, but the dampness hung in the air, and Martin's unease grew with each passing mile. He'd been warned of course everyone had. The village he was heading to was known for its superstitions, and they had their stories. The one about the lantern, however, was the most chilling. They said that on certain nights, when the fog rolled in thick and heavy, you could see the light of an old lantern drifting through the woods. No one knew where it came from, but they all agreed on one thing: those who followed it never returned. Martin had laughed it off. He didn't believe in ghost stories. He was a man of reason, a skeptic through and through. So when he reached the old bridge and saw the flicker of light ahead, he rolled his eyes. Just another traveler, he muttered to himself, but the figure was moving too swiftly, too steadily for someone on foot, and it wasn't the kind of lantern you'd expect a simple candlelight. This was old-fashioned, flickering glow that danced eerily in the thick fog. Intrigued despite himself, Martin slowed his car and followed. He drove cautiously, trying to keep the light in sight. His hands gripped the steering wheel, sweat starting to form on his brow despite the cold. The mist seemed to grow denser, thick enough that he could barely see a few feet in front of him. The light moved ahead, still keeping its distance, but it didn't seem to fade. As Martin drove deeper into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop. The trees stood like sentinels on either side, their bare branches swaying with an unnatural rhythm. The road seemed endless. Martin's eyes darted back and forth, trying to track the lantern, but it always stayed just out of reach. He was almost lost in his thoughts when he noticed something strange. The light had stopped moving. It hovered just ahead, like a beacon in the fog. Martin's heart began to race. an instinctual sense of danger prickling his skin. Taking a deep breath, he parked the car, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled the keys from the ignition. He stepped out of the vehicle, the cool air biting at his face, and looked around. There it was, the lantern. It hung in the air, just beyond the trees. The glow was steady, but there was something wrong about it. Something unnerving in the way it flickered like a heartbeat. It wasn't right. Against his better judgment, Martin moved forward, drawn to the light like a moth to a flame. His footsteps were swallowed by the mist, and with every step, the air grew colder. He soon found himself standing in a clearing, the light directly in front of him. But there was no lantern. Instead, a figure stood, cloaked in shadow. Its features were indistinct, its face hidden in the deep folds of a hood. Who are you?" Martin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure did not answer. It just stood there, unmoving, the light around it flickering with an otherworldly glow. Martin took a cautious step forward, and that's when the figure turned its head. In the shadows, he could see no eyes, only a dark void where its face should have been. Before he could react, the figure reached out toward him, and the fog thickened, swallowing him whole. Martin tried to scream, but the air was too thick, too suffocating. It felt like time stretched into eternity, and then nothing. The next morning, the fog had lifted. The road was clear again, the woods still and quiet. The villagers found Martin's car abandoned on the side of the road, the door ajar, the key still in the ignition. But there was no sign of Martin, no trace of him anywhere, and the lantern, it was gone too. Rain had started suddenly, a heavy downpour that caught Amelia off guard. Had been walking home from the village market, her basket of groceries tucked under her arm, when the clouds seemed to open up all at once. The road leading to her cottage was narrow, bordered by dense trees on either side. It had always felt a bit oppressive, the trees closing in like a dark tunnel. Amelia had grown used to it, but tonight something felt off. The air was thick with moisture, and the scent of wet earth filled her nose. The only sound was the pounding, the rain against the leaves, and the soft squelch of her boots in the mud. She was nearly halfway home when she noticed something in the corner of her eye. A figure standing just off the path in the shadow of the trees dotted at first. She thought it was a trick of the rain, the way the droplets blurred the shapes around her. But when she blinked, the figure was still there, standing perfectly still, watching her. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. It was a man, or at least the shape of a man. Though his features were obscured by the rain and shadows, he was dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden beneath the hood. He didn't move. Not even when Amelia stopped and stared. She took a cautious step forward, calling out, "Hello, can I help you?" The figure did not respond. Amelia's instincts told her to keep moving, to run back to the safety of her cottage, but something kept her rooted to the spot. She squinted through the rain, trying to see more clearly, and that's when she realized the truth. There was no face under the hood, only darkness. Her blood ran cold. The figure hadn't moved, but she could feel the weight of its gaze, could almost hear the breath it wasn't taking. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The rain seemed to grow heavier, the darkness closing in around her. But when she reached her cottage, slamming the door behind her, she was safe at least. She thought she was. Hours later, as she tried to sleep, the sound of raindrops tapping against the windows grew louder, almost as if someone were knocking. The knocks continued, rhythmic, insistent, that Amelia shuddered, pulling the blanket tighter around her. She could hear it clearly now. There was someone outside, tapping on her window. She couldn't bring herself to look, and then the tapping stopped. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, but then she heard it, a soft whisper, coming from just outside the door. "Let me in." Amelia's eyes widened in horror. There was no one there, only the rain. But as she sat trembling in the dark, she realized one terrible truth. The figure was still watching. That it had been a long day for Rachel. The road home seemed never-ending, winding through the barren fields of the countryside, the rain falling heavily and distorting everything around her. The car's headlights barely pierced the sheets of rain, and the occasional gust of wind rattled the windows. Rachel was used to these long drives. She had lived in the country all her life, but tonight something felt different. She had to pass the old farmstead on the edge of the field, an abandoned place that had been empty for years. Ever since the previous owner, a man named Tom, had disappeared. People said he'd gone mad, that he'd heard voices in the fields and had started seeing things. Strange eyes in the grass. Rachel had always dismissed these stories, but tonight, something about the place made her uneasy. As she drove past the old farm, a flash of movement caught her eye. A figure standing in the tall grass at the far side of the field, just outside the reach of her headlights. It was fleeting, like a shadow, but it was enough to make her pulse quicken. She slammed her foot on the brake, her heart racing. Nothing. The figure was gone. Rachel frowned, forcing herself to calm down. It was just a trick of the rain, a shadow cast by the trees or the wind. She wasn't going to let a silly ghost story get to her. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. When she reached her farmhouse, she felt a sudden urge to glance back at the field. Her eyes locked onto the dark, empty stretch of grass. The rain was still falling heavily and the fog had rolled in, but then, through the mist, she saw them two pale, glimmering eyes staring back at her. Rachel froze. They were too far out, too far to be human, yet they glowed with an unnatural light. Almost as if they were reflecting the headlights. They didn't blink. They didn't move. Her breath hitched in her chest as she slammed the car door and ran inside. Locking the door behind her, she hurried to the windows, peeking out through the curtains. But the field was empty. There was no sign of the eyes. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The storm continued into the night. Rachel lay in bed, but sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, felt like it was coming from outside, from the field. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that the rain stopped, and the world outside fell into an eerie silence. Just before dawn, Rachel heard a soft knock at her door. She froze. Another knock. Her heart raced. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. She tiptoed toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Then she stopped. A voice, soft but clear, came from the other side of the door. Rachel. It was the same voice she had heard from the field. The same voice that had haunted Tom before his disappearance. Let me in. Rachel backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The voice persisted, gentle, coaxing, desperate. Rachel, open the door. The air grew colder, the room darker. Something was pushing against the door, like fingers running over the wood. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Rachel's breath was shallow, her body frozen in fear. And then, as though it was waiting for the right moment, the voice spoke one last time. Look out the window. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she turned, unable to resist. Through the fog, she saw them two pale eyes staring back at her from the field, just as they had before, but this time they were closer, much closer. Megan had always found the small cemetery near the village to be an unsettling place, especially at night. The graveyard sat at the edge of a dense forest, and there were rumors about the old stones that had been buried under moss, the gravestones with names no one could remember, and the crypt that was said to house something far darker than just bones. She'd heard the stories. People said that in the dead of night, if you wandered through the cemetery, you could hear whispers, ghosts of those who had been forgotten, pleading to be remembered. Megan had never believed any of it. Of course, ghost stories were just that, stories. But that didn't mean she liked walking through the cemetery alone. Yet here she was, a few weeks after her grandmother's funeral, standing at the edge of the graveyard, clutching a bouquet of flowers. Her grandmother's headstone had been placed near the back of the cemetery, near the old crypt. Megan had promised her grandmother she would visit often, but this would be her first time back since the funeral. As she walked toward the grave, she felt an odd sense of discomfort, as though something was watching her. The rain had stopped, but the wind still howled through the trees, making the air feel cold and damp. She set the flowers down on her grandmother's grave and stood in silence for a moment, trying to hold back the tears. Suddenly, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The wind had picked up again, and the trees creaked in the distance, but nothing else stirred. Megan shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling. She needed to leave. She had already stayed longer than she intended. As she turned to walk back to the gate, something caught her eye. A stone, buried in the ground near the crypt. It was old, worn, with no name on it, just a cracked surface, covered in moss. Megan's curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped closer. As she brushed away the dirt and debris, a name began to emerge, scrawled faintly across the stone. Eliza Thornhill. Megan's brow furrowed. She'd never heard of anyone named Eliza Thornhill in the village. The name was strange, She wondered if it was one of the long-forgotten villagers who had passed away years ago. But as her fingers brushed over the stone, a shiver ran down her spine. There was something wrong. The air around her felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't explain. A voice sobbed, like a whisper seemed to drift on the wind, though no one was around. "Don't forget me." Megan spun round, but the graveyard was still empty. She stared at the crypt, an unease settling deep in her gut. "Don't forget me." The voice was closer now, behind her dot, and then, as though it had been waiting for her to notice, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Megan looked down, her heart pounding in her chest. The stone had cracked open, and from the earth beneath it something reached out, cold, skeletal fingers grasping for her. Every autumn, the village of Hollow Creek would come alive with an eerie tradition. It wasn't the harvest festival or any of the usual merrymaking that people looked forward to. It was the walk to the roan tree. No one could quite explain why, but every year the villagers would gather at dusk, walking in summer silence through the mist-laden woods until they reached the ancient tree at the center of the forest, a tree that had been standing for centuries. It was said to hold a dark secret, and every year it demanded something from the village. Harper had grown up hearing the stories. As a child, she thought it was just superstition, a story told to keep the younger ones in line. But now, as an adult, something in her bones told her there was more to it. It seemed the way the older villagers acted as the days grew shorter, how their eyes grew distant, how their lips would form a grim line when the roan tree was mentioned. This year, Harper had promised herself she would stay away from the walk. She didn't believe in the old legends, but her nerves still tingled every time she thought about the tree. The branches twisted like gnarled hands, and the red berries that grew in abundance each fall seemed to bright against the shadows of the forest. But that evening, as dusk fell and the mist rolled in, she found herself at the edge of the woods. Anyway, a pull, like a whisper in her mind, urged her to go. Her feet moved before she could stop them, and soon she was walking among the others, her heart thudding in her chest. The villagers were silent, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They walked in a line, heading deeper into the woods, the ground soft and wet beneath their boots. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and Harper's breath came out in shallow gasps as they neared the roan tree. There it stood, tall and imposing, its twisted limbs reaching toward the sky. The red berries on its branches glowed with an almost unnatural light, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. But what made Harper's stomach drop was the figure standing at the base of the tree, a woman, pale, thin, with long, tangled hair. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, tattered and stained, and her eyes were wide, glassy, and unblinking. "You've come," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. "The roan tree calls for its tribute." Harper froze, her throat closing. The villagers stopped behind her, their eyes downcast, avoiding the woman's gaze. She realized with a chill that they were not here to honor the tree. They were here to offer something. Someone died suddenly. The woman turned toward Harper, her eyes locking onto hers. "It's your turn now," she said, and the ground beneath Harper's feet seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the once silent forest filled with the sound of whispers, like the voices of the past crying out before Harper could react. The woman stepped forward and touched her arm. The chill from her touch spread like ice through Harper's body. Her vision blurred, and the world around her began to twist and shift. The roan tree's branches moved, bending toward her, their shadows twisting like fingers reaching for her soul. Harper felt a sudden jolt, as if something was being pulled from her very essence, her life force, and then everything went dark. When Harper awoke, she was lying on the damp ground. The villagers gone. The woman, too, was nowhere to be seen. The roan tree loomed above her, its branches as still as death. But when Harper stood, she realized something had changed. Her reflection in a nearby puddle showed a woman she didn't recognize. Her face was older, her eyes sunken with shadows that hadn't been there before, and the berries on the tree, they were gone, replaced by something darker, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But then, in the distance, she heard the whispers again, softer but persistent. "You belong to the tree now." Ashford Hall was a place of legend in the small town of Ashford Hollow. The grand mansion with its high stone walls and ivy-covered windows had stood empty for decades, but not for lack of curiosity. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, sharing stories of the house's tragic past. Many believed it to be cursed, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had become dangerously thin, and at the heart of the mansion, so they said, was a mirror that could show more than just one's reflection. For years, Claire had heard the rumors. They said the mirror in Ashford Hall could trap your soul, that whoever gazed into it long enough would disappear from the world, leaving only an empty shell behind. But it was just a story, a tale to frighten children, she thought. That was until the day she received a letter dotted. It was a plain envelope, no return address, and inside was an invitation to visit Ashford Hall. The letter was signed with a name Claire didn't recognize, Eleanor. Ashford died with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Claire decided to visit, and nothing to lose. After all, the townspeople had abandoned the place long ago, and Claire figured it would be just another abandoned house, empty but for dust and cobwebs. But when she arrived, the mansion felt different. The air was thick, with something history, sorrow, or maybe just the weight of years. The door creaked open as if it had been waiting for her, and Claire stepped inside, the smell of old wood and decay filling her lungs. She wandered through the halls, marveling at the faded grandeur, the portraits on the walls staring down at her with lifeless eyes. Eventually, she found her way to the parlor, where a large, ornate mirror stood against the far wall, framed by darkwood dot. It was beautiful, but the moment Claire looked into it, she felt something shift. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating, and for the briefest moment, her reflection didn't match her movements. It was as if the woman in the mirror was staring at her, waiting for something. Claire shook her head, trying to shake off the sensation, but her reflection did not move with her. It stared back at her, its expression cold, its eyes full of something she couldn't identify. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror smiled, a twisted, malicious grin that didn't belong to Claire. She gasped, stumbling backward, but the reflection did not stop smiling. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a distorted whisper. "You're already part of this place." Before Claire could react, the room around her began to darken. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching toward her as though they were alive. The air grew colder, and the glass of the mirror began to crack, each fissure spreading like a spider's web across the surface. Claire turned to run, but as she reached for the door, a hand cold and pale wrapped around her wrist, pulling her back. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Her reflection was no longer behind her, it was standing